The morning in Denver began like any other. Thin rays of sunlight piercing the low rooftops, the distant rumble of the school bus, the warm scent of toast rising from tiny kitchens. In the midst of that familiar rhythm, an old man stooped over, wiping every inch of stainless steel in the charity kitchen at the end of the block. No one knew his name. No one thought of him as an essential part of the place. He was simply Old Man Samuel, the first to arrive, the last to leave, never uttering a single complaint. But what if I told you that the man you see there was once a Marine, that he saved hundreds of lives during a secret operation, one still unacknowledged by many in the government to this day? Would you believe it? This story didn't begin with fireworks or a live broadcast. It began with a single ironic remark, a short video clip, and 45 years of silence. What happened next stopped an entire city in its tracks. All right, my dear audience, get ready for a tale that will leave you in awe. Take just a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly connect with what I'm sharing here. And drop a comment below to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always amazing to see viewers joining us from every corner of the globe. Samuel Carter wasn't the sort of man who stood out. He'd never been the kind to enter a room and make every head turn. But at West Ridge Community Kitchen, a charity kitchen on the edge of Denver's working-class district, he was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Each morning, when a light fog still clung to the window panes and the cold seeped through the gaps in the worn wooden floorboards, Samuel stood there, sleeves rolled up, back bent as he stoked the fire. He began his day with one long, silent breath. People recognized his face, a tall, thin old man with freckled, weathered skin, a slightly stooped spine, yet a resolute bearing. Each step he took carried the momentum of years, neither hurried nor weary, simply steadfast. He showed up at 6 o'clock sharp, when the city still yawned. No one told him to come early, no roster demanded it. Yet he did it anyway, as if it were a sacred rite, as if without it he wouldn't be himself. Folks assumed he was lonely, elderly, perhaps living on a meager pension, cooking free meals just to feel life still had meaning. They looked at him with a mix of sympathy and pity, maybe even indifference. But what they didn't know was that this quiet man had once stood in a hail of bullets beneath a moonless sky, where there were no comforting words or cheering crowds, only lives hanging in the balance and a weight of duty heavier than stone. In 1974, during Operation Fallen Reach, the fierce fighting between U.S. forces and local guerrillas descended into chaos when enemy jamming and artillery fire severed all communications. 218 soldiers lay isolated at 3 different positions. No reinforcements, no orders, and only hours of rations left. Back then, Samuel was a communications engineer, a staff sergeant in the Marine Corps. With only broken equipment pieces, copper wire scavenged from an old Jeep, and a soggy topographic map, he rebuilt an improvised field signaling system. No power, no instructions, only his calloused hands and a will not to let his comrades die in silence. And that system worked. The links were restored, supply points pinpointed, helicopters touched down before dawn. 218 soldiers were saved. When asked to file his action report, Samuel penned a single line. "I did what I was obliged to do." Nobody at West Ridge ever learned of it. He'd never spoken a word. For Samuel, that past wasn't something to parade. It was part of his very bones. Fragments of memory buried beneath restless sleep, echoes of days he chose to keep silent. So every day he washed the counters, peeled vegetables, carried trays, stirred the soup, He listened to spoons clinking bowls, the laughter of the homeless, the soft "thank you" from those who'd seen hardship. In those small sounds, he found his purpose again. That kitchen was where he belonged, not because anyone forced him, but because there he knew he could still make a difference, whether it was a hot meal or simply a familiar face. No one saw it. But in each motion of wiping a table, sweeping out the ashes, washing a pot, stood the silhouette of an old Marine, still on duty. Only now, his mission was quieter, and instead of gunfire, there was the scent of fried onions, the gentle simmer of soup, and grateful eyes held in hushed silence. That morning began like any other. The air was still crisp, and a thin veil of frost clung to the windows of the West Ridge Charity Kitchen. Samuel Carter, clad in a faded silver-gray coat and with an old apron draped over his shoulder, quietly stepped down from the delivery truck. His hands trembled slightly from the cold, yet his movements remained sure, etched into his muscles by decades of routine. He stooped, lifted a box of frozen meat from the truck bed, turned slowly but deliberately as he walked into the kitchen. His eyes did not sweep the room, not because he didn't care, but because he was far too accustomed to being unseen. Just as he passed the prep station, a voice rang out from behind, neither loud nor spiteful, yet clear enough for everyone nearby to catch. This old man must have come straight from a We-Too punishment oven. The words tumbled from a young volunteer's lips. They carried no anger, no pointed mockery, only the careless cruelty of someone convinced they were always right. The remark hung in the air like a dull blade, not sharp, yet enough to cut deeper than flesh, into one's pride. Samuel did not turn. He did not respond. He set the meat box on the counter, slowly peeled off his gloves, wiped the mingled beads of sweat and frost from his brow. His face showed no anger, nor did it betray sadness, only a dense, profound stillness. As if those words, though not unfamiliar, had stirred something he had buried long ago, a tiny crack in the hardened stone he used to keep himself upright. A few steps away, a young female volunteer sat nursing a cup of coffee. She heard the comment, she saw the look in Samuel's eyes, and moved by some instinct, she pulled out her phone and began recording. The frame did not shake. It did not move. Simply captured Samuel standing there, head bowed as he cleaned his hands, then turning to step further into the kitchen. No words were spoken. No one else appeared in view. Yet that very silence struck a different chord. The video ran exactly 17 seconds. No effects, no background music, just one caption. The old cook said nothing in return. Uploaded to TikTok that afternoon, it initially garnered only a few dozen views, but nobody expected it. Within 24 hours, it exploded beyond anyone's control. Thousands of shares, hundreds of thousands of views, an unending stream of comments. Half expressed outrage. How could such a kind, gentle old man be ridiculed where he came to help? The other half were filled with sorrow, because they saw their own fathers, grandfathers, those who had sacrificed in silence and never told their stories. In an old wooden house in North Carolina, a bald, sun-weathered man sipped his morning coffee, idly scrolling through TikTok. When that clip appeared on his screen, his finger froze, and his heart pounded. He knew the man in the video, recognized that gait, those hands. It was Samuel J. Carter, the buddy who'd saved his life and the lives of hundreds more during Operation Fallen Reach in 1974. On that dark night, when artillery shells rained down on the camp, It was Samuel who crawled back through the wire, pried loose jammed equipment, and re-established communications with command. Because of him, 218 soldiers were airlifted to safety before the base was obliterated. Then he vanished. No one knew where he went or how he lived, until that very morning. The veteran in North Carolina did not hesitate. He called the Veterans Association, emailed the Marine Corps HQ, shared the video on veteran forums, and the fragments of memories from decades past began to piece together. Soldiers who'd seen Samuel standing amid the storm of bullets now spoke up one by one. Samuel Carter, though, remained unaware. The next morning, he still rose at 5, donned his coat, arrived at the kitchen. He still carried meat, still chopped vegetables, still didn't touch a phone. And he had no idea that his 17-second video had set a nation alight. And then, in that quiet, history began its own return. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or sip a glass of water and listen on for the twists that lie ahead. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always amazing to see people joining us from every part of the globe. Comment 1 if you enjoyed this story so we can keep bringing you more. In a quiet corner of North Carolina, at a routine veterans gathering, the big screen played that 17-second clip now sweeping the internet. No soundtrack, no effects, just the image of an old man standing silently in a charity kitchen after a young staffer had thrown out a mocking remark. Yet something in that stance struck one man in the audience silent. He stepped forward toward the screen, his heart pounding, his eyes widening. "I know him," he whispered. "That's Carter, Staff Sergeant Samuel Carter." All eyes turned. No one spoke. This was the man who'd served alongside him in the 7th Marine Regiment. Once a comrade, always a comrade. And now, here he was, forgotten beneath indifferent stares, in a society that no longer recognized its own heroes. Less than 2 hours later, a message arrived at the 7th Regiment's headquarters. An old unit email address confirmed someone reporting that he had indeed fought beside Samuel Carter. The records team sprang into action. They opened the archives, rows of aged dossiers resting quietly under the dim yellow lights. And then they found it. The file bore the name: Staff Sergeant Samuel J. Carter. The service record was intact. Every handwritten note still crisp, each neat line reflecting the discipline of a model Marine. Highlighted achievements: designed the emergency field communication system during Operation Fallen Reach, 1974. Directly intervened to secure the relay station under murderous fire. Declined the 1975 Medal of Honor, citing, "I remained silent so my comrades could be honored first." All of that, once the lifeblood of a critical mission, now lay dormant in a dusty briefcase no one had opened. Those concise descriptions contained the lives of hundreds of soldiers. The story became clear. There was no doubt left. Samuel Carter was not merely a silent old man in a charity kitchen. He was an indispensable part of the living history of the U.S. military. A man who had risked everything to keep the only lifeline open on the battlefield, who had saved 218 fellow Marines with his ingenuity, courage, and calloused hands. And when offered recognition, he chose to stay silent. No photograph of him had ever hung on a wall. No article had ever been written about him. Samuel disappeared from the public eye just as he had slipped away from the battlefield, quietly, making room for those who never returned. That 17-second video shattered 40-odd years of silence. A buried memory brought back to life by a single glance, a single posture, a single moment of stillness. From North Carolina to the 7th Regiment's dispatch centers, word raced back to Denver. In the West Ridge kitchen office, Samuel Carter was still washing trays, unaware that an entire chapter of history was rising again, calling his name. And this time, the world could no longer look away. 1 week after that video went viral, the morning in downtown Denver began with a strange silence. The sky was clear, the sunlight gentle. No car horns, no music drifting from the cafes along Waller Avenue. Residents stepped out of their homes. Passers-by paused in their tracks. Everyone sensed that something unusual was approaching. Then came the drumbeat. Not the festive clamor of a parade, but a slow, deep thump, as if echoing from the heart of the earth, from memory itself. A resonance familiar only to those who'd once stood on the front lines. Before long, figures appeared at the end of the street. 6 Marine battalions, marching in from different states under the early sun, uniforms crisp, boots gleaming, faces as stone, no fanfare, no music, no announcements, just their presence, a presence that made the air itself feel heavy. Leading them was a senior officer, his expression solemn, in his hands a small velvet box. Inside, the Veteran Best Stories Medal, an award not for battlefield glory, but for quiet courage. For the one who chose silence over boastfulness, yet did what no one else dared. As they neared the West Ridge Community Kitchen, locals lined both sides of the avenue, not cheering, but watching with surprise, with emotion, then bowing their heads in respect. Children clasped their parents' hands, elders pressed hands to their chests. Fellow veterans stood, saluted in ceremonial fashion. Some wept without realizing it. And there, among the line of onlookers, stood Samuel Carter. He hadn't come to stand in formation. He wore his apron still tied at the waist, a large wooden spoon in hand beside a pot of simmering soup, his face calm, as though nothing out of the ordinary were happening. Yet in his eyes shimmered a light of quiet bewilderment and profound depth, as if memories long buried were returning, one step at a time. When the formation halted before the kitchen door, the officer approached him. No opening remarks, no microphone. He simply stood before Samuel, lifted the velvet box with both hands, gently opened it. The sunlight struck the metal, making the metal gleam, unostentatious, yet warmly radiant, real. Samuel looked down at the small object. His eyes neither glistened nor trembled, but his chest rose and fell. The spoon in his hand dipped slightly with the weight of the moment. In that instant, not a word was spoken. All of Waller Avenue seemed mesmerized. Time froze, broken only by the whisper of wind against the flag flying high above. Then Samuel nodded, not much, just once, but that single nod sent hundreds of hearts exploding in silent joy. The officer pinned the medal to the left side of his chest, right over the spot where his heart had beaten in service all those years without complaint. There was no speech, no fireworks, and because of that, the ceremony felt sacred, more so than any military ritual ever broadcast. A man once forgotten had been called by name, by the march of boots, by the gaze of comrades, and by a silence filled with reverence. Samuel did not leave his post. He turned back to the soup pot, stirred gently, as though resuming an ordinary workday, yet his hand trembled ever so slightly. The tremor of a man unaccustomed to being seen, suddenly brought into the light. Not the glare of a stage, but the glow of truth. The formation stood at attention. After a few minutes, the officer returned to the ranks. All saluted one last time, then marched on. They did not stay for a meal. They did not need cameras. They needed only for him to know. They remembered him. They had never forgotten. As Samuel watched them fade down the sunlit avenue, he stood quietly once more, but this time not from hurt, but from finally being seen. That ceremony had no lively soundtrack, no lengthy speeches, only the heavy stillness of silent gazes, eyes reflecting the past, and a cold wind from the north slipping through the makeshift canvas tent in the square. Among the veterans in crisp uniforms and the hastily arranged wooden benches, the young man who'd mocked Samuel Carter that day stepped forward, head bowed. Each step weighted with regret. He no longer carried the careless swagger of his first day, his eyes averted, his fingers clutching the hem of his shirt. When he looked up, he saw dozens of eyes fixed on him, not to condemn, but to await a genuine word. He inhaled deeply. His voice trembled as he spoke, without a microphone, just loud enough for all to hear. I was wrong. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were, and I am sorry. Silence followed. Not an indifferent silence, but a hush, in which each word fell like a soft sob in a cathedral. The veterans exchanged glances, then turned toward Samuel Carter, who still stood behind the steaming soup kettle. Samuel did not nod. He did not smile. He simply met the young man's gaze for a few seconds. No reproach, no anger, just a look full of life wisdom and understanding. And perhaps it was that look which made the young man break down in tears. At that moment, Denver's mayor climbed onto a small wooden podium. She opened the papers in her hand, but did not read them. Our town once forgot you. Now it's time to make amends. She turned toward the charity kitchen, whose faded sign read West Ridge Community Kitchen, and declared, "We officially rename this place Carter Community Kitchen, so that no one will ever forget the name that saved hundreds of lives and still feeds hundreds of hungry people each day." A sustained round of applause rose, longer than usual. Not a shout, not a cheer, just hands clapping in steady rhythm, like the community's heartbeat being revived. Samuel remained where he stood. He did not step forward or bow. His hand still gripped the ladle's handle. The metal gleamed in the weak winter sun. But everyone knew, even without his words, that this honor touched him more deeply than any medal. That afternoon, representatives from the Veterans Affairs Office approached Samuel, presenting him with an invitation to become honorary advisor to the local youth training program, not to recount battlefield tales, but to teach how to fold blankets, wash pots, respect those around you, and keep your word. When asked, Samuel simply said, "If they want to learn how to be decent by standing in a kitchen, then I can teach." And so, from the next day on, at Carter Community Kitchen, an informal class began. Children came to help cook, listening while peeling potatoes and wiping tables. Sometimes he'd share the story of a bland lunch in the relay station back in 1974. Other times, a lesson in patience as he timed boiling eggs perfectly. But everyone knew what they were really learning was how to live kindly. On the old brick wall, the new name was hand-painted, Carter Community Kitchen. Beneath it, a quotation without citation, but believed to be Samuel's own. "Don't wait to be remembered by living well. Live well, so you will be remembered." No trumpets, no drums, only the smell of thin soup, the laughter of children, and the silhouette of a quiet man wiping a tabletop with a worn cloth. And somehow, Denver had taken one more step toward gratitude. Each day thereafter, Samuel still arrived at the kitchen before dawn, the sky not yet fully light, the streets still drowsy, and there he was. He wore his old apron, frayed at the hem, and the faded baseball cap he habitually turned backward, steps slow yet sure. His calloused hands moved deftly, slicing vegetables, flipping pots, rinsing rice, as if no number of years had ever weighed upon his shoulders. When he kneaded dough, his shoulders bent forward, his whole being absorbed in the motion, deliberate yet unwavering. The neighborhood folk had grown accustomed to that sight. Yet since that ceremony, something had changed, not in Samuel, but in how people saw him. Children began to visit the kitchen more often, not merely to eat, but to learn. They were taught how to tie knots, how to hold their hands spotless when passing someone a cup of coffee. They listened as he spoke, not of war, but of keeping promises, of patience with a simmering broth, of the art of soft bread guided by the dough's moisture. Samuel spoke slowly, no need to raise his voice, yet there was something in his choice of words, in the way his gaze lingered on a vague spot on the ceiling, that held the children utterly still. They did more than listen. They absorbed. They remembered. One Saturday afternoon, as Samuel scrubbed a cutting board after the lunch rush, the young man who had insulted him long ago stepped in, holding a box of hot tea. He wore no suit, no cap, just an ordinary young man returning to a place he once overlooked. He set the tea box on the stainless steel counter, bowed his head. "I'm sorry again, sir." Samuel looked at him. Without a smile, without changing expression, he simply nodded. "How we treat others is a choice," he said. "Today, you chose differently." The young man stood silent, then withdrew a napkin to wipe his sweating hands, quietly stepped away. No more words were needed, for those simple, steady ones had granted him a chance to grow kinder. That day, a new wooden sign was mounted on the brick wall outside the kitchen, its faded paint and hand-carved letters catching the late afternoon sun. Carter Community Kitchen, where honor need not be spoken, only remembered. People photographed it, shared it online, but Samuel paid no heed. He continued wiping the tables, checking the spice jars, reminding the children not to leave the soup pot lid ajar. That evening, Denver was quieter than ever. No car horns, no festivities, just the hush of a day made whole. Samuel sat alone on the back stoop of the kitchen, where he paused a few minutes before turning off the lights. His gloves, rubber and faded, still on his hands. He gazed up at the starry sky, the same ritual he had kept every night for decades to mark the fact that he was still alive. Samuel smiled softly, the smile fleeting, yet enough to illuminate the memories etched deep upon his brow. Behind him, the kitchen lights cast small, trembling glows in the night breeze, holding warmth for the entire block. No one captured that moment. No one filmed it. But for those who had received his steaming bowl of soup, who learned from him how to press a knife without tearing a cutting board, who felt the trust in his steady gaze, that was the moment of a legend. Not because he once received medals, not because he saved 218 lives, but because he chose to keep living with kindness when no one else was obliged to be kind. Those days held no grand events. No television crews came, just ordinary days, shaped by a legend. In a world rushing ever forward, where loud noises often drown out the quiet, Samuel Carter's story reminds us that true honor need not be proclaimed. It need only be lived each day. With perseverance, humility, and compassion, he showed a whole community that you need no uniform to continue serving your country. only a hand ready to help at the right moment, and a heart that never closes. If this story made you pause a little longer, think a little deeper, and regard some unnamed stranger with Ni,